I like to point out that traditionally, in the centuries-old liturgical tradition of the church, today is actually one of the Epiphanies. The 3 Epiphanies that are part of the Feast of the Epiphany, which we just recently celebrated. The first one was to the Magi, and the second was the baptism itself as a epiphany, appearing to Jesus as he began his public ministry. And then today was the epiphany of Jesus, his first public miracle. And it is a very, very rich, it's just a one marvelous, marvelous scene. It's so revelatory of what God's attitude is towards us and how he wants to treat us and how we should approach God. Just think of it. First of all, it's a marriage feast. It's a whole village celebration, no doubt. A joyous occasion. And Jesus and his disciples and his mother were there. So they like joyous occasions. They're not sitting on some, in some cave, That's the first thing. But then when the wine runs out, because these affairs went on for days, in that culture, they did run out of wine. And Mary notices it, and Jesus at first doesn't want to seem to not want to respond, but then he does, and he fills 20 or 30 gallons times 6 is 120 or 180. Think of that. Jesus knows that people have already drunk probably too much. They've run out. And instead of saying, naughty, naughty, no more for you, which is what holy people would probably do, he shows who God really is, and he makes 120 or 180 more gallons of wine for people who are already tipsy. What does that say about God's celebratory instinct to make us forget ourselves and celebrate and enter a whole new mind space or heart space? And not only, gallons and gallons of wine, but the best wine. And that's what God wants to serve us, the very best wine. I don't know what Christian denominations who refuse alcohol, where they're coming from. But certainly not from this. And we can so easily think, I had a little bit too much to drink. Well, obviously you don't want to get drunk, but on the other hand, you should be celebrating. You shouldn't be afraid to celebrate. Now, of course, you can run away from your sufferings by drinking, and that's not what we want either. What Jesus wants is that we face all our sufferings and all our weaknesses and all our failures, and then he still brings us the wine of his presence and of his Spirit and of his grace. That's what he uses. We don't have to pretend that we're perfect in order for God to give us his grace, which is what I was taught. But we have to come to him the way we are. I'm poor and are weak, and I'm suffering, and I'm traumatized, and I'm afraid. And God takes all of that, embraces it to his heart, and celebrates his grace and his love and his mercy with us. We come as we are, in other words. That wedding garment is quite simply our willingness to be who we really are before God, that honesty and that joy. Now people, of course, many people are in recovery, and that's a very beautiful and challenging journey. And many friends and a family member myself who are doing that. But it does remind us that we can and should celebrate, and also that we're on another level here of celebration, a mystical level, a mystical wine, the Spirit is coming to us. And that's intoxicating too. People are looking for ecstasy and intoxication in all sorts of ways, but that's what we're called to. We're called to be ecstatic out of our egos, out of our usual mindset and heart set, and be intoxicated with God. When Jesus says at the Last Supper, I won't drink of this fruit of the vine again until I drink it anew in the kingdom, I don't think he's talking about regular wine. He's talking about the wine of God's love and the God's Spirit. And that's what we should really focus on. And every day in the monastery, I was, as you know, a monk for more than 20 years. Every single day at morning prayer, we sang the famous hymn, Splendor Paterni Gloriae of St. Ambrose. And my favorite line in it is, Le tibi habemus sobriam ebrietatem spiritus, which means, let us joyfully drink, the sober drunkenness of the Spirit. Isn't that a great line? The sober drunkenness of the Spirit. In other words, we do get drunk, but it's sober. It's way above our usual consciousness, or deeper than our usual consciousness. And every day we sang that. Today, let me get drunk with God, the sober drunkenness of the Spirit. And what is it all for? Well, the wedding feast. It's no accident that all this happens, this revelation of God's love and exuberance, superabundance of God's grace, 180 gallons. It comes at a wedding feast, because that's what life should be. I read a good line from one of the contemporary spiritual writers, who's a good friend of mine. Life is not a test. Life is not a school. Life is a playground. Life should be joy. It should be play. And it's preparing us for the wedding feast. How many times throughout the scriptures, how many parables that Jesus tells her about the king gave a wedding feast for his son, and for some reason we don't believe it. According to the parables, we go off and do other things and get distracted. Who wouldn't want to spend your time at a wedding feast and celebrate, to prepare for the wedding feast that never ends? That's what heaven is. A wedding feast where we're continually drunk on God and connected to one another as the guests at the wedding feast, or as members of one body, as we hear in that second reading today. But that's what we're called to. That's clearly what the goal of our spiritual life is, and what heaven is. The great mystics like John of the Cross and Teresa of Jesus present, the mystical marriage as the goal of life. Goal of the spiritual life, therefore the goal of life itself. So we should be preparing for this marriage. We should believe in it. We are so precious in the eyes of God, precisely if we have no pretense about being good, great, or perfect, or any of that, hypocritical pretense, but just come as we are, and then God sweeps us up in his mercy and love, as Jesus did all through his earthly life, and is still doing now, the Eucharist and elsewhere. And that's the wedding feast itself. It's the wedding banquet is the Eucharist. The bread and wine transformed into his own body and blood. And that exuberant first reading from Isaiah about how precious we are in God's eyes. You will be a diadem, you will be a crown of glory, a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord. And then the names, you will no longer be called forsaken or desolate, but you'll be called married, and my delight in her. By the way, I like to point out, those are actually names. I don't think they're names that are given too often today, but they were in past centuries. Married is Beulah, and my delight is in her is Hephzibah. Those were girls' names, as you probably know. And they reflect the scriptural reality that we are married to God and God's delight is in us. Just as we heard last week, you are my beloved children in whom I am well pleased. You are a glorious diadem in my hand. You are married. I find my delight in you. We don't even believe that, do we? Oh, I can never be God's delight. I'm not good enough. Or God doesn't care. Or I don't care, because I don't think God cares. No. we have to change our whole view of how God views us, what our destiny is, what's a possibility for us. So once we begin to assimilate and metabolize this truth, this life-changing truth that we're married to God and we're His delight and we should be drunk on Him, well, then we can find our place in the world and in the church. How can I live this out according to my particular personality, my gifts, my calling? And that's what the second reading is about. The one Spirit, this intoxicating Spirit that's given to all of us in our baptism, and that forms us or prepares us to exercise our role in the world and our role in the church. Maybe we're called to the married life, as most people are, or whatever else it might be. We are called to live that reality every day of being God's beloved and teaching our children the same thing. They're God's beloved. And reminding ourselves that everyone is God's beloved, even those who don't agree with us politically. I repeat, everyone is God's beloved. We should treat them that way. But we won't treat them that way, and we can't treat them that way unless we believe in ourselves about ourselves. And then we don't have to project and scapegoat and all that other stuff that we do to make ourselves feel better and think, well, at least I'm better than they are. No, you're not. You don't have to be. We're all in it together. We're all called and beloved by God. We're all His delight. And if we all believed it, the world would be a different place. So let's start not just believing it, but living it with exuberance and joy.